Hi everyone, we hope that you are doing well. Professor Gomez and Professor Jacobo here. And we were reflecting on this week's assignments. We know that your reading is a complex one, a very large chapter, as well as your discussion board question. So we wanted to assist you a bit and as we ourselves reflect, of course, on this important topic. The topic is race, one of the most very difficult things to discuss. Now, we know that while it's not a biological concept, the idea of race is a real social construction that gives them the nice privileges.
As I have it in the slide, the term race used infrequently before 1500s. It was used to identify a group of people with kinship or group connection. However, during the 17th century, you have European Enlightenment where they were actually looking into this, applying science into all these categories of races. So over the centuries, the false notion that white was inherently smarter became accepted worldwide. And that's what I have in the next slide by Samuel Morton, who created this creepy, really sad relationship between the skulls,
Pseudoscience, right?
Pseudoscience, the skull of whites, blacks, and as we can see right here, how their brains or the skull or their cranium was not formed the same way as white. So this is something that was actually bought at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So the next slide that we have, it really deals with the concept of race in the U.S. So in the U.S., the term race was deeply connected with the terms white and slave. And as you know it, when the first Africans came into the 13 colonies, the idea of slavery was not really established in the U.S. because both white and black came as an indenture. It was later, as I have it in the next slide, that after the mid-1600s, slavery became a legal establishment in the U.S. colonies. This is really important for you to understand because the idea of what was white and the privilege of being white was also transferred to property in terms of blacks and others who were not white at the time. So the next slide, we're going to cover a little bit more of what Raymud Paredes covered in the AntiMexican sentiments. I'm going to let Professor Jacobo to go over these little bullet points that we have right here.
So let's continue. You want to talk a little bit about the Moorish presence in what is now Spain?
Well, let's go back a little bit because if you go back to early 1500s, this is when the Europeans are exploring the New World. Mm-hmm. And not only the New World, let's not forget that the first slave came from the west coast of Africa. So the English encountered the African, perhaps let's call it these different ethnic groups from Africa. And at that time, the English devised a scale of human beauty and purity. And when you read the chapter of Raymud Paredes, they talk about how during the Elizabethan era, the scale of beauty went from blonde perfection to black hiddenness. I mean that they hate blacks. But English also clashed with Spain. And I guess we're gonna have to go back a little bit in time, 711, because this is when the Moors, the northern tribes of Africa, which were represented by the Moors, they came across, invaded Spain. It was almost 800 years of war called the Reconquista. And even though there was a clash, a war, they ended up mixing. Mm-hmm. So the idea of a Spanish mixing with the Moorish was something that the English saw it as an abomination. At that time, Moorish was also equated to blacks. Mm-hmm. And let's not forget that the blacks were at the bottom of that scale.
Mm-hmm. So let's encapsulate this entire, proposal, everyone. You're reading a document entitled "The Origins of Anti-Mexican Sentiment," and what Raymud Paredes proposes, and we're echoing those sentiments, is that the anti-Mexican sentiment begins obviously not in Mexico and the United States in that relationship, but it already had, if you will, roots in Europe, right? Part of that root had to do with racism, if you will, right? Quote unquote. The idea that non-whites were inferior. And also now we have the argument, of course, also of religion, right? You have the Protestant Reformation And the accusation, as you see, of course, in your reading assignment, that the Catholic Church was blasphemous, was in a sense anti-Christian. In fact, they refer to the Pope as the Antichrist.
And he was the devil himself.
Right, correct. And a lot of this had to do, obviously, not just with religion and race, also politics and economic interests, right? And quite simply, the European English and Dutch feared the Spanish kingdom because they spread Catholicism, right? And you can see this in the famous argument of the sword and the cross, that Spain and the Vatican were, in a sense, together, correct?
Yeah.
Again, the anti-church sentiment is very, very important because it adds fuel to the anti-Spanish sentiment. As Professor Gomez already alluded to, the idea that the Spanish was of a lesser race, if you will, right, having been miscegenated with the Arab Muslim, right, populations during the period of presence, of course, in what today is Spain.
Yeah, let me add something, because also at this time, the English, the Puritans are looking into migrating also into the American colonies. Correct. And they bring these ideas with them. And that's really important to understand, because you might think, well, why the colonies felt that way? Well, because the idea of this, the concept of Catholics being corrupt, they were afraid that the colonies were going to be also tainted by Catholicism.
Well, again, quite simple. If you have an anti-Spanish, anti-Catholic sentiment, in other words, as Professor Gomez earlier stated, if the Spaniards were toward the bottom of the scale, right, of beauty, knowledge, and power, because they had been racially miscegenated with the Moors, the Mexican is going to be even further down the scale, because now they have indigenous ancestry, right? So we're looking again, and by the way, it's very important, we always remind you of this, to think in context. Otherwise, we run the risk of not really understanding the subject matter, and of course, even offending ourselves. It is simply important to understand in context, but it is a very interesting part of history.
Yeah, something else that is really important as you read the chapter of Raymud Paredes, how the colonies were receiving all this literature, this anti-Catholic literature. And that's something that you are going to have to explore, because, for example, we have Robertson, who trashes the Mexicans and the indigenous people of Mexico. And then you have to understand that the Spanish also mixed with indigenous, giving the mestizaje, you know. And once again, the idea of this mixing was something that the colonists did not really appreciate. So on the next slide, when Anglo-Americans were encountering Mexicanos in the Southwest, they already have all these ideas.
Preconceived idea, exactly. And so, again, I think an excellent point, Gomez, that you make, Professor Gomez, that, think of the importance of the literature, in a sense, legitimizing those kind of erroneous and obviously wrong sentiments or ideas. Also, perhaps as scholars, you can think, what is the long-term impact, right, of that kind of mentality? Because you have people who are reading these things, and these are folks that are, if you will, in charge of political structures, economic structures, right? What is the long-term impact of that kind of mentality?
Yeah. Well, we did this so you can have a better understanding of how this, in a chronological order, the sense of this hatred or the anti-Mexican sentiments evolved in the Southwest. And we still have it to some extent.
Yeah, I agree 100%, exactly.
Well, I hope you enjoy it, and we are going to do this in our next reading.
Take care of yourselves.
Take care.